The digital guillotine didn't fall with a loud crash, it fell with a quiet click, one silent move that sent shockwaves through Hollywood, through Buckingham Palace, and straight into the heart of Montecito. And the man who pressed that button wasn't a journalist, wasn't a royal, wasn't a politician, it was the most powerful man in streaming. And with that single unfollow, a $100 million fantasy began collapsing in real time. This wasn't just social media drama, this was a public execution of a brand, carried out in silence while the world was still sleeping. Because behind the glossy photos, the carefully staged interviews, the perfectly filtered image of success, something else was happening. Something Hollywood insiders had been whispering about for months. Deals were stalling, calls weren't being returned, meetings were getting rescheduled and then quietly canceled. And then came the story that changed everything. The streaming giant that once rolled out the red carpet was now quietly rolling up the contracts. No more documentaries, no more lifestyle empire, no more blank checks. Just like that, the experiment was over. But the real drama didn't start with the cancellation. It started with a meeting, a Zoom meeting to be precise, the kind of meeting where careers are saved or ended. Executives on one side of the screen, expectations on the other, and somewhere in the middle of a conversation about falling numbers and declining viewership, something happened that people in that virtual room still can't stop talking about. The screen went dark, the laptop closed, and just like that, the meeting was over. No resolution, no agreement, just silence, the kind of silence that in Hollywood means one thing: this relationship is over. And that's when the financial autopsy began. Because when analysts started digging into the numbers, what they found didn't look like a media empire. It looked like a warehouse. Warehouses filled with products. Unsold products, jars, boxes, packages, thousands of them. The grand vision of a global lifestyle brand had quietly turned into shelves of inventory that nobody was buying. Executives thought they were investing in royalty-level storytelling, global access, prestige content. Instead, they were staring at jam jars and peppermint tea that couldn't even break into the top rankings. The gap between expectation and reality wasn't small. It was catastrophic. Think about how fast the narrative flipped. Not long ago, the world was told this was the future of media, the future of royalty, the future of Hollywood. Now, industry insiders were using words like overpromised and underdelivered. In Hollywood, reputation is currency, and once that currency collapses, the fall is brutal and very public. And when a CEO hits unfollow, it's not just a social media move, it's a corporate message, a signal to every studio, every producer, every executive: the protection is gone. The doors are closing. The phones may stop ringing. But while Hollywood was dealing with the financial fallout, something else was happening thousands of miles away, on the icy grounds of Vancouver. And this is where the story stops being just a business failure and starts becoming something much more uncomfortable. Because the event that was supposed to be about wounded veterans and resilience started getting a new nickname behind the scenes. Not Invictus, something else. Something insiders were whispering when cameras weren't rolling. And the reason they were whispering is because what the public saw and what people on the ground saw were two very different realities. Photos showed crowds, excitement, energy, cheering audiences, but raw numbers told a different story. Shockingly different. In one major event arena built for thousands, the number of actual paying spectators was reportedly just a few dozen. Dozens, not thousands. And that's when the optics operation allegedly began. Staff, volunteers, people being moved, positioned, grouped together, not for the event itself, but for the cameras. Because in the media world, perception is reality, and reality can be rearranged if you control the camera angle. And then came the moment that disability advocates would later describe as deeply uncomfortable to watch. A wheelchair, a camera angle, a repositioning that to some viewers looked helpful, but to others looked like something else entirely. Something staged, something controlled, something that raised a question that still hasn't gone away. When does helping become managing, and when does managing become using? Because to the veteran community, a wheelchair isn't a prop. It's personal space. It's independence. And that moment, caught on camera, told a story that no press release could fully erase. By this point, the cracks weren't small anymore. They were visible. Hollywood pulling away. The media deal was wobbling. The public image was shifting. And behind the scenes, executives were starting to realize something they hadn't realized before. They thought they had signed a deal for royal storytelling, historic access, global impact. But what they got instead was a business model built around boutique products and aesthetic details, while the content pipeline sat waiting for scripts, waiting for production schedules, tables, waiting for something that never fully arrived. And as millions of dollars sat in unsold inventory, the big question inside boardrooms became brutally simple. How did a $100 million media deal turn into a boutique jam business with blockbuster expenses? That question didn't just damage a partnership, it damaged credibility. Because in the entertainment industry, there is one unforgivable sin, not failure, but disappointment. Failure can be forgiven, disappointment cannot. And just when it seemed like the story couldn't get more uncomfortable, a new video appeared. Soft lighting, garden scenery, a carefully framed moment of motherhood. At first glance, it looked personal, private, intimate, but then investigators noticed something small, something almost invisible, a microphone, hidden but visible if you knew where to look. And that tiny detail changed the entire narrative, because microphones mean production. Production means planning. Planning means this wasn't a private moment at all. It was content, carefully filmed, carefully framed, carefully released at a time when the business needed saving. And suddenly, a very uncomfortable question started circulating in media circles and legal circles at the same time. If a private family moment is actually a filmed commercial production, where is the line between family and brand? Because when an empire starts shaking, when deals start disappearing, when public opinion starts shifting, history shows that desperate pivots often follow. And this pivot, the one involving image, family, branding, and timing, might be the most controversial move of all. And according to people watching very closely, this is the moment where the story stops being about a failed media deal and starts being about something much bigger. And that's where the story takes a darker turn, because business failures are one thing, bad press is another, but what started happening next was something that even seasoned Hollywood crisis managers were quietly calling a line-crossing moment. Because when a brand starts collapsing, there are only a few moves left: rebrand, disappear, or create a new emotional narrative strong enough to make people forget the numbers, the contracts, and the warehouses full of unsold products. And right when the financial reports and industry leaks were reaching a boiling point, a perfectly filmed, perfectly lit, perfectly timed home video appeared online, presented as a private family moment, but analyzed by professionals as something very different. Because hidden in plain sight was the detail that changed everything: a professional-grade microphone attached to clothing in what was supposed to be a spontaneous family moment. And in media production, microphones are never accidental. They mean audio monitoring, recording equipment, production planning, multiple takes. In other words, not a home video, a shoot. And if it was a shoot, then the next question becomes unavoidable: what exactly was being sold in that video? A product, an image, a narrative, or something much more valuable, public sympathy at a moment when public perception was starting to turn? Because the timing of that video was almost too perfect. Within days of damaging reports, falling deals, and industry criticism, suddenly the narrative shifted to soft lighting, flowers, family, and motherhood. In crisis management, this strategy has a name: narrative redirection. You don't fight the bad story directly, you replace it with a more emotional story. And nothing is more powerful in public relations than family imagery, especially when the public image of a brand is under threat. But this is where the situation became legally and ethically complicated, because once a video stops being a private memory and starts functioning as promotional material, different rules apply. Very serious rules. And while media analysts were debating the marketing strategy, another explosion hit, but this one didn't come from Hollywood or Netflix. It came from a book that insiders say had been causing panic behind the scenes for months before it was even released. Because unlike tabloid articles or anonymous sources, this was something else entirely: a full investigative biography written by someone known for dismantling reputations piece by piece, document by document, interview by interview. And when the first chapters were published, the reaction was immediate, emotional, and very public. And according to crisis management experts, that reaction may have made the situation far worse, because there is a phenomenon in media called the Streisand effect, when trying to shut something down only makes more people look at it. And the stronger the denial, the louder the outrage, the more curious the public becomes. Suddenly, the book wasn't just a book anymore. It became an event. Sales exploded, rankings climbed, and the narrative that had been carefully managed for years started slipping out of PR control and into public debate. Former staff, former insiders, former associates, people who had stayed silent before were now being discussed again. Their stories resurfacing, their claims being re-examined, but this time not as rumors, as part of a documented investigation. And while all of this chaos was unfolding in public, something very strategic was happening in private: silence. Total silence from the one institution that for years had been at the center of the entire story. No interviews, no public fights, no dramatic statements, just silence. And according to psychological experts, silence in a power conflict is not weakness, it's a tactic. Because when one side stops responding, the other side loses the conflict they were using for visibility. No fight means no headlines. No headlines means no narrative. And without a narrative, there is nothing left to sell. But behind that silence, government discussions were reportedly beginning to move in a direction that, if true, would change everything permanently. Not tabloid rumors this time, actual parliamentary discussions, official records, legal frameworks being mentioned in government transcripts. Words like titles, removal, legislation, words that had once sounded impossible were now being spoken in official settings. And if there is one thing history shows, it's that reputations can survive scandal, they can survive financial failure, they can survive media backlash, but they rarely survive legal action tied to status and identity. And then came what might be the most devastating shift of all. Not financial, not legal, but personal. Because according to multiple insiders, the real damage wasn't happening in public anymore. It was happening in private conversations, private opinions, private circles of power where reputations are truly decided. Hollywood can forgive failure if you are profitable. The public can forgive scandal if you are likable. But elite circles, they do not forgive embarrassment. And in those circles, the word that had started appearing in conversations was not victim, not misunderstood, not targeted. The word being used was liability. And once that word starts appearing in boardrooms, palaces, and media offices, the end usually comes quietly, not loudly, not with a big announcement, but with fewer invitations, fewer calls, fewer deals, fewer appearances, until one day people realize the empire didn't explode, it just slowly disappeared. And that is why this entire story feels less like a scandal and more like a slow-motion collapse. Because collapses in the modern media world don't happen with a bang. They happen with unfollows, with canceled meetings, with silent institutions, with warehouses full of products, with perfectly timed emotional videos, with books that won't go away, with silence where there used to be protection. And now the biggest question isn't what already happened, it's what happens next. Because history shows that when a public brand built on influence, image, and access begins to lose all three at the same time, the final phase is always the most unpredictable: reinvention, disappearance, or escalation. Those are usually the only three options left. And if the past few weeks are any indication, this story, this very public, very dramatic unraveling, isn't over yet. Not even close.